All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kate Stryker. I'm the Director of Resilient Community Planning for Pattern for Progress. And today we're just giving a quick overview of our recently released report, Built for Cars, Ready for People, How to Meet Community Needs Through the Redevelopment of Oversized Parking Lots. Before I dive into the presentation, I just want to thank our Patterns members for making this possible, this research, and also say if we have time at the end, we will get to questions. If you have a question, go ahead and drop it in the chat. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. All right, so I imagine many of you are here today because you have seen a large underutilized parking lot somewhere and thought to yourself, wow, I wish that were something else. That seems like a waste of space. And you want to know about what could be done about those parking lots. So in researching for this report, we sent out a call to planning professionals in the region and asked them to send in their list of underutilized and large parking lots. And when we aggregated all that input, and we got a fair amount of items on that list, when we aggregated it, top of the list were strip malls, shopping centers, and near train stations. So these are parking lots adjacent to those types of uses. These are common. If you drive around the Hudson Valley, you will see them. And Pattern feels that these underutilized parking lots are a great opportunity because one, and primarily because they're located with existing infrastructure and services. They're also tend to be located next to places where people want to go. So before we talk about why and how to develop these parking lots into something new, we're going to talk a little bit about why we ended up with so much parking in the first place. So my screen is not advancing. Hold, please. I'm just waiting for the screen to advance. I'm not sure why it's not working. Oh, okay, here we go. So why is parking overbuilt? Why do we have so much parking? And this is true across the United States, and so it's not just specific to Hudson Valley. And the reason is simple. Land use regulations often include parking minimums. And these minimums serve a purpose. They're there to promote easy access, to promote safety, prevent vehicular congestion on the streets. But many of these mandates were set in a very different era from the one in which we live, and they're quite often excessive of our needs today. So most parking mandates in local zoning codes come from the 1950s and 1960s. And if you think about this time, this was an era when there was decentralization of cities, people were moving out into suburbs. At that time, land was considered cheap and abundant. People did most of their shopping in person. Car ownership was on the rise. There was a massive expansion of the American highway system, and climate change was not well understood at that point. So if you go through this list and you think about the moment we're in currently, most of these are no longer true. Here in the Hudson Valley, there's a great interest in preserving land for farmland, for open space, and developable land is often, there's competing uses for that land. People are no longer doing all of their shopping in person. I look out my window and I see 9 Amazon trucks every day. People are moving back into our urban centers because they want to live in more walkable communities. And if you skip down to the bottom, obviously climate change is a great threat that we're all coming to understand how we need to respond to it. So, but these mandates were developed in the 50s and 60s, and many communities are still living with them, with the consequences of them, and they're still in the local zoning. So if we look at how this plays out for a typical commercial retail space, under many local land use laws, the typical requirement is that for every 1,000 square feet of retail, that mandates 4 spaces of parking. So if you look at this top row here, this is your sort of typical big box store. So a Target, for example, might be around 100,000 square feet. Given that local mandate at 4 spaces for every 1,000 square feet, that means if a developer builds a Target, they have to build 400 spaces of parking, which in turn equals around 120,000 square feet of land. That includes the spaces between the parking spaces, the rows for the cars to turn in and out, and that turns to about 2.75 acres of land. 1.2 million square feet, that is the size roughly of one of the shopping malls in the Hudson Valley. Under that parking mandate at 4 spaces for every 1,000 square feet, that would mean the developer would have to build 4,800 parking spaces, which equals around 1.44 million square feet or 33 acres of land. So what you get and what you see is for large commercial retail spaces, they're often surrounded by a huge area of asphalt. And that is by design, that's mandated. And one other thing, besides this being developed in a time when people did most of their shopping in person, these mandates, and this was true across the country, were often set based on need on the highest use day of the year. So we're talking about one of the days leading up to Christmas when you might see these parking lots at 100% capacity, but the rest of the year they are much below that as far as use. And I'll say now, if you do a windshield survey and drive around and look at large shopping centers and their parking lots on any busy Saturday, they're often under 50% of use. So that's sort of how we got to where we are. And as I mentioned, these large underutilized parking lots are everywhere. So Pattern decided to do this report because there's several reasons to focus on parking lots. First and primary reason is because of their potential to meet community needs. If you look at the list here, the top item is housing. If you're familiar with Pattern's work, you know that we do a lot of research on housing needs in the region, and almost every community that we work with and know is struggling to meet the housing needs in their community. And one of the top reasons for that is land, the availability of land, the costs of land, but also the cost of infrastructure. And so if you remember a couple slides ago, I talked about how parking lots tend to already be served by infrastructure such as sewer, water, electricity, and roads. And so you're sort of cutting at those top concerns by focusing attention on these parking lots. But there's other community needs that could be met by redeveloping these parking lots, including developing new economic development opportunities, potentially siting renewable energy on the parking lots. I don't think that's a common use, but there's probably some instances and other things as well. The next reason that we're focusing on parking lots is because there's a cost to parking lots. And this in turn affects the affordability of goods and services and housing and other things. So land and the construction of parking and then the maintenance all comes at a cost. So just this last month, we had some major snowstorms in New York, and you can imagine that the owners of large parking lots have to go out and plow them, salt them. There's a cost. And again, those expenses get passed on to the consumers, to the tenants. The next reason we're focusing on parking lots is because overbuilt parking tends to spread destinations farther apart from each other. And it's sort of this self-fulfilling thing where you build a big parking lot and then people are sort of forced to have to drive because the walking and bicycle experience is not pleasant when there's just seas of asphalt. So really thinking about changing the land use towards a more sustainable and efficient use, a more mixed use development pattern by focusing on these lots. Another reason to focus on parking lots is the issue of flooding. There has been an increase in major storm events in recent years, and many of our communities are vulnerable to the risk of flooding. So if you think about a parking lot, it's a large impervious surface. That means that water can't get absorbed into the ground and it is forced to run off. And what happens is it runs off towards lower elevations. If you read the report, I think there's a sentence that says a parking lot upstream may mean a flooded home downstream. The water runs off, it overwhelms the drainage systems. And then there's also the challenge related to this that stormwater runoff over parking lots can also have oil. You think about what parking lots are used for parking cars. So there's going to be pollution and oil on those parking lots. And so that overflow of water can cause broader ecological impacts. The next reason we're focusing on parking is because of the fact that hard impervious surfaces in developed areas tend to be hotter on high heat days than surrounding vegetative areas. This map on the right here shows a built out commercial, mostly retail area in Ulster County on the left side. You can see there's a lot of parking spaces, impervious hard surfaces, and then the map on the right shows the average surface temperatures in summer months between 2018 and 2024. And you can see that there's hot spots on the hard impervious surfaces. And then if you look at the surrounding areas, it's about, well, here it's showing more than 20 degrees, but the difference between an urban and surrounding area can be around 10 to 20 degrees on average. So as we see an increase in high heat days, this is more and more of a concern. The people who are most vulnerable to high heat tend to be people who don't have access to a vehicle, elderly, people who don't have air conditioning. And so there's real public health risks associated with this as well. So again, I think we make a pretty compelling reason why we're focusing on parking. So what can be done about it? I'm just going to talk briefly about some state and local policies. First, to change parking requirements, so preventing the development of new parking, which is excess of need, but also ways to redevelop existing parking. And then the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about local efforts to redevelop parking lots. So the city of Kingston took the bold move to eliminate parking in their new zoning code and parking requirements. And the reason they did this was to make development, basically to reduce the costs of development in order to encourage more affordable development, especially housing, but also to promote a more walkable mixed use community. So that's our sort of local example. But there's several states, this is just a few, the list is longer than this, that have passed statewide regulations to really reduce those parking requirements. In Montana, they cap any municipal zoning requirement at 1 space per unit, and they ban minimums for most commercial and tiny residential units. In Maine, they are prohibiting mandatory parking minimums across the state and across all municipal zoning codes. And Illinois, they're really targeting reducing parking minimums to developments that are near transit points. And what they're doing is basically telling the developer, you decide how much parking you need based on the use that you're planning. So those are requirements, or those are changing mandates, but there's also a couple examples of statewide legislation to incentivize or encourage the reuse of already built underutilized parking. In Washington State, they have a program called Underdeveloped Urban Land Tax Deferral Program. And this basically offers tax exemptions on construction costs for projects that include affordable housing. And then in New Jersey, they just last year passed the Stranded Asset Redevelopment Law. And this is, it's not focused on parking, it's focused on vacant malls and office parks, but including the large parking lots associated with those structures. And it basically, for projects that are eligible based on size and vacancy thresholds, mixed use is a permitted use as of right. So there are challenges to redeveloping parking, as you can imagine. This is not a comprehensive list, but in our interviews for this report, these were sort of the top hits. And the first is zoning regulations. As you can imagine, if you're going to convert an entire parking lot or part of a parking lot into a new use, such as housing, that's going to require, in many cases, a zoning change. And that can be an arduous, long process depending on the community. The second major challenge and barrier is when we look out and we see what looks like a single parking lot at a shopping mall. If you look at the individual parcel files or parcel shapes for that lot, it may actually be multiple owners. And so redeveloping that site may require some multiple parcels and transferring ownership to a single owner. There's also the issue that for retailers that are leasing land, there may be lease agreements on that land for use of the land for parking. So for example, if you think about a Target that's within a larger shopping mall complex, the owner may find it desirable to redevelop that land for something new. Even the Target may say, yeah, it'd be great if there was housing here because then we would have, new customers, new potential workforce. But because of the lease agreements, it would require some untangling in order to actually make that happen. And then the last major barrier, and this is a big one, is that we still live in a culture where cars are sort of prioritized. And so in planning, but it's also true that, parking continues to be a need. And so there's really, if you're developing parking lots for new usage, you're going to be increasing the use there. And so, any project like this does require really understanding what the future parking needs will be and developing a plan around that. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a minute presenting a local case study, and this is here in Orange County. And I'm also going to announce that the Planning Commissioner, Alan Sorensen, is on our call today, and I spoke with him about this project. He's part of he's working with the developers on this. And this is it's in progress. So the plan here is for they're calling it the Wallkill Reinvestment Corridor. And if you look at this top picture on the right, you'll see this is at the intersection of State Route 17 and 84. There's the Galleria Mall on the right, and then a large number of big box stores and parking lots. And so this team has put together a plan to basically increase the use of this area to make it a more mixed use development, and to really take advantage of the fact that there's a MTA train station there, that there's a lot of commercial activity happening in this area already, and how can we really build this out to make it a more mixed use space. So their plan includes new residential units, a hotel, office space, attracting new manufacturing to the area, improved access and use of the existing Middletown train station, and actually building out a bicycle and pedestrian trail that would connect to downtown Middletown. And there you can connect to the Heritage Trail, which goes to other parts of the county. So here's an overview of their plan. We're really focused for the purpose of today down here where you see the mall and you see the residential. And here, if you zoom in, there's this planned residential structure here next to the Galleria Mall. And this site was selected because it's close to the train. As you can see, there's sort of a dotted line over here to this train station, thinking about increasing the use, creating housing, and taking an advantage of the existing infrastructure that's there, including the roads, the interstate, the existing sewer and water, locating this housing near to shopping and other economic activity. And it also was found to be the most underutilized section of the large mall. And when I look at this picture, what I note is this plan is for 250 units of housing, or at least that's what it was when I interviewed them. And that's a lot of housing. And you look at just the small section of the parking lot that is occupied by this development. So I think there's really incredible opportunity as shown here. And when I finish the presentation, if you have questions about this project, I'm going to offer Alan for that. So just a few more slides. We have a few for communities that are considering this challenge, we have a few recommendations. The first of which is really about new development, so eliminating parking minimums, and instead, in place of that, requiring that developers submit a parking management plan. So in that parking management plan, they sort of assess their own parking needs. They can propose the number of parking spaces, but there's also other creative ways they can meet their parking needs. So the second recommendation here is for municipalities to do an inventory and identify underutilized parking lots that could be suitable for redevelopment. And then once that's done, to contact the owners, see if they're willing to redevelop those, and then work together to issue an RFP or an RFEI for the development of those sites. So really taking a proactive approach to getting those lots into higher use. The next recommendation is for sites where parking is still a need, but a community wants to see a higher use there, to use a tax increment financing method to support the construction of parking garages or underground parking. So those projects tend to be relatively expensive, which is why we don't see a lot of them in our area. But there are examples of communities where they use TIF financing, which is where you basically take a baseline value of the current use. So in this case, it would just be a surface parking lot. And then with the planned redevelopment and the higher intensity of use, you look at the increased property value. And so the difference between that baseline and the increased property value, or the increased tax revenue rather, is the tax increment. And then you dedicate the increment tax revenue for the construction of that parking lot. Once that tax increment financing term expires and financing is repaid, then the municipality gets the full higher property tax. And obviously you get the higher use and community asset out of that project. And then the final recommendation we have is in the case where you have a parking lot and for whatever reason, redeveloping it just doesn't seem feasible, to consider partnering with a solar developer to bring on renewable energy. It could be solar canopies if you still need the use of the parking lot, or it could be converting the site to siting renewables altogether. So I think I left us about 5 minutes for questions. Again, I just want to thank you, Pattern. I want to thank Pattern's members for making this research possible. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. And I also want to give Alan a chance to just say hi if he's here. Any questions? Can't hear Alan. I don't, there's Alan. Hi, Alan. Is your audio working? Nope. All right. Well, we can, okay, so here's a question. I've seen TIFs used in other states. Any local examples? The example I have is not a local example. If you saw it in the report, it's the example we point to is in Indiana. But I know TIFs are used. I know that they've been used in New York City, but I'm not personally familiar with any examples here in the Hudson Valley. But if anyone else has examples, please chime in on that. So Trevor Riddle asked, after removing minimums, do developers still need still tend to overbuild parking voluntarily? That's a great question. I doubt it. I doubt they would overbuild just because of the high cost of that. But I think it depends on how you're defining overbuilt. Um, if you're trying to provide one parking lot for every unit, I wouldn't consider that overbuilt. I really think it depends on the specifics of the community and the needs to know whether that's true. Are there any municipalities in Dutchess County considering repurposing any parking lots? Not that I know of, but there may be people on this call who know better on that question. Why aren't any businesses, property owners made to clean up sites that move out when they close a business, abandon a building or a property? They build everywhere, and then when a business goes out, fails, they just leave an eyesore behind. That's a great question. I'm not going to try to answer that. Maybe someone else has an answer. I think there are things that communities could do I know that, not that we're talking about renewables, but I know that, for example, when solar projects are permitted on farmland, sometimes part of the permitting includes a requirement to clean up at the end. So I think there's potential for that. Moving on, any local examples of large scale solar canopies in Dutchess. I'm not aware of any large ones, but again, somebody wrote the town of Poughkeepsie. Great. Um, I know Ramapo College in New Jersey, the entire student parking lot is covered with solar canopy. So I've seen examples of it. I think there's one in Ulster County. Is Pattern submitting this recommendation to the legislature? No. However, they may read our report. Alan, I'm just going to invite you on. I don't know if your mic got sorted out or not. No, you're still on mute. So no. Okay, I just see the mute. All right, I'm going to keep going, but I would love you to join in if you want. I believe Mount Vernon is considering a TIF near one of its Metro North train stations. That's good to know about. Croton on Hudson owned. Oh, hi. There we are. Okay. For the last minute. Any questions for Alan specifically on the Walk-Hill project that I went over?
Okay.
Do you want to give us an update on where we are with that project, or maybe not?
Yeah, just a quick update. I'm sure most of the listeners will appreciate this. We've just had a change in administration in the town, so now I'm reaching out to meet with the new supervisor and some of the council members to kind of restart the process and commitment to the project. So, but I do think there's, I at least have received positive feedback, and I'm very optimistic. But a little hiccup in the process, but we're still moving in the same direction.
Thank you, Alan. I see that Joe Chaika, hi Joe, dropped a resource. I just clicked on it. It's a link worth checking out if you want to click on it. And I also see that we're at time. So, whoa, there's a lot more questions suddenly. I think we're at time though. I do want to be respectful of people's time. So again, thank you all for joining us. That was a quick overview. The report's available. So please check it out, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Very good.
Thank you all.